I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen Bee.
5 minutes changed everything. Behind a closed palace door, King Charles faced the woman who had stood beside him through decades of scandal, rejection, and eventual triumph, and removed the last protections she believed were still hers. There was no ceremonial warning, no carefully softened compromise. A file had surfaced, Charles had read it, and by the time his pen touched the final page, Camilla's remaining authority was gone. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles kept one hand on the file as silence stretched between them. The Emergency Household Directive, a formal order controlling how royal staff, money, correspondence, and internal instructions are managed, sat between husband and wife like a boundary. He stripped Camilla of independent staffing authority, restricted correspondence access, designated spending control, and the right to send instructions through his household without written approval. She would remain beside him publicly, but the machinery that turned influence into palace action had been dismantled. Camilla watched his face harden as he read the evidence again. She had seen anger before, but this was different. Disbelief had drained into disappointment. When she asked whether he truly intended to trust the papers over her, the king did not answer. That silence mattered, because their marriage had survived years of pressure through private loyalty, and now that loyalty was being tested against duty to the crown. The room tightened when Charles pushed the directive toward her. Camilla refused to touch it. Her voice sharpened, insisting everything could still be explained, but he pulled the paper back. Then came the gesture that ended the argument. He signed. No raised voice, no theatrical threat. Just ink, consequence, and a line neither could pretend had not been crossed. The evidence was more disturbing than one unauthorized instruction. It showed a chain of private household orders affecting access, correspondence, and the positioning of people around the monarch. What frightened Charles was the pattern, decisions moving through the palace with the force of his authority when he had not approved them. This was no longer about hurt feelings. It was about who could speak in the king's name. William already knew safeguards were being imposed. The prince had been informed before Camilla entered, proving the structure around her was being limited before she could argue. When she rose to leave, humiliation gave way to a darker realization. Others had known. Others had prepared. The family around the crown was already choosing sides. The signature ended Camilla's authority in seconds, but the deeper wound lay with those closest to them, and that is where the crisis turns next. Power explains only half of what happened. The rest is painfully personal. Charles did not strip authority from a distant courtier. He stripped it from his wife. Camilla did not merely lose palace privileges. She watched the man whose loyalty had defined her adult life choose the crown over her judgment. And William, standing just beyond that marriage, now faced an uncomfortable truth. His father had finally drawn the boundary he had resisted drawing for years. Camilla sat alone after the directive was signed, staring at a silent phone in painful silence. She expected Charles to return, soften the order, or at least explain himself without officials between them. He did none of those things. The queen consort remained publicly beside the monarch, but that public role now hid a private fracture. Charles had defended her through years of hostility. Yet as sovereign, the person responsible for protecting the authority and trust of the crown, he now had to defend the institution from confusion inside his own household. Charles felt the weight of that contradiction when William paused outside his study. The prince entered carefully, carrying none of the satisfaction his father feared he might see. "It is done," the king said. William simply nodded. He understood that procedure had won, but he also understood the cost. His father had just placed royal duty above the woman he had spent decades protecting. William had his own reason to remain uneasy. As heir, the person next in line to inherit the throne, he had learned that unofficial influence becomes dangerous when staff cannot tell where private preference ends and royal authority begins. He had noticed that problem before, but suspicion was not proof. Several aides had behaved as though two channels of command existed, one flowing through Charles and another moving around Camilla. Charles finally admitted why the evidence frightened him. Some decisions carrying Camilla's influence had reached staff in language that made them appear to reflect his own wishes. The king could forgive disagreement inside a marriage. What he could not ignore was uncertainty over who had the right to speak in his name. William answered with a confession of his own. He had seen warning signs months earlier, but had stayed silent because confronting his father without evidence could have looked like an attack on Camilla herself. The future king had waited, watched, and hoped he was wrong. Then one memory returned with brutal clarity. Months before the emergency order, a private Windsor reception had exposed the same hidden problem in a single unauthorized instruction. The humiliation did not begin with the file Charles signed today. It began at Windsor, where one crossed line became impossible to erase. Every royal crisis has a moment that seems minor when it happens, and enormous in hindsight. For this one, that moment came at Windsor. A guest was waiting, an aide was confused, and an instruction, carrying Camilla's authority, suddenly overruled arrangements Charles believed he had personally approved. What followed lasted only minutes. Yet those minutes created the first unmistakable proof that two different chains of command were operating beneath one crown. Charles had already noticed small signs of friction inside the household, but he had refused to treat them as something darker. Camilla's senior staff had begun sending decisions directly to departments that normally waited for clearance through his office, the central team responsible for confirming what the monarch had personally approved. He saw those overlaps as administrative pressure, not rebellion. The king trusted his wife, and he resisted any suggestion that private rivalry was growing around them. The atmosphere changed during a private Windsor ceremonial reception. Charles had personally approved a longtime royal associate for a restricted gathering after the formal event, a smaller invitation-only meeting reserved for people given direct clearance. Minutes before entry, the guest was stopped. An embarrassed aide discovered that Camilla's office had issued a contrary instruction, removing the name. The queen consort had not simply questioned the invitation. Her household had acted against something the monarch believed was already settled. Charles found out only when the guest prepared to leave. His reaction was immediate. He turned to Camilla in front of two senior aides and asked why his authorization had been reversed. She did not retreat. She told him she believed the change protected him from an unnecessary complication and prevented an awkward encounter that could have distracted from the evening. Then one aide produced the internal message. Charles read it once, then again. The wording did not present Camilla's intervention as advice or preference. It suggested that the king's household had already approved the removal. That single distinction cut deeper than the guest list itself, because staff reading the instruction could reasonably believe they were carrying out the monarch's own wishes. Charles said nothing more. He folded the page once and placed it inside his jacket. Camilla watched him do it, understanding that the argument had moved beyond the reception. The king did not accuse her again that night, but the paper did not disappear. Months later, that message became the first item placed inside a confidential review, a private examination of internal records used to establish who authorized sensitive decisions. More documents followed. More instructions matched the same pattern. Windsor was no longer an isolated mistake. Windsor gave Charles suspicion, but the completed review gave him certainty. And when husband and wife finally faced each other across the same table, neither could retreat behind palace courtesy anymore. There were no advisors sitting between them. No communications secretary, no private secretary, no carefully prepared statement to absorb the impact. Charles wanted the confrontation alone. Camilla entered, expecting an argument over procedure. Instead, she found the evidence arranged in chronological order before his chair. The first question was devastatingly simple. Had she, or anyone acting under her authority, allowed palace staff to believe that her instructions carried the king's personal approval? Charles had dismissed every aide because he wanted one answer without palace language softening it. The private secretary, the senior official who manages the monarch's official work and communications, had already handed him the records, but the king needed to know whether the pattern came from Camilla herself, from protective staff, or from both. Their marriage was no longer sitting safely outside the crisis. It had become part of it. Camilla understood the danger immediately. If she admitted directing the system, she could lose what remained of her influence. If she blamed her staff, she would abandon people who believed they were defending her place beside Charles. Then he pushed one message across the table. She read it slowly. "Did you speak in my name?" he asked. The queen consort set the page down and insisted she had never intended anyone to misunderstand where the instruction came from. Charles did not soften. Intention, he told her, was no longer enough. Camilla's composure finally cracked. She accused him of allowing William's suspicions to infect their private trust, turning every mistake into evidence against her. The king's face hardened at his son's name. He warned her that dragging the prince into the argument would not erase what was written in front of them. Then Charles produced a second record. This one cut deeper. Concerns raised inside his own office had been redirected before reaching him, meaning information intended for the monarch had been filtered elsewhere. He stared at the page longer than before because the issue was no longer just who gave orders. It was about what he had been prevented from seeing. Camilla finally admitted she had approved stronger household coordination. She believed Charles was exhausted, surrounded by competing demands, and needed protection from constant internal disputes. She called it shielding him. He called it control without permission. The silence that followed was colder than the argument. Charles did not shout. He simply told her the matter had moved beyond marriage, and the next steps would be enforced by people whose loyalty belonged to the crown. Their argument shattered the last illusion of privacy, because once the crown itself had been compromised, power moved beyond Camilla's reach. The most painful decisions inside a monarchy are rarely enforced by dramatic speeches. They are enforced through locked channels, withdrawn permissions, altered reporting lines, and people quietly discovering that yesterday's authority no longer works today. After Charles made his decision, William became the human guardrail around it. He did not seek Camilla's humiliation, yet he understood that if the order contained exceptions, personal pressure could slowly restore everything his father had just removed. William sat with Charles late into the evening, studying the final implementation notes line by line. The prince had been asked to review how instructions moved between royal offices, making sure no unofficial route could rebuild the authority that had just been stripped away. These reporting lines were simply the formal paths staff used to pass orders, approvals, and sensitive information. That mattered, because confusion over those paths had created the crisis in the first place. Charles remained the final authority, and his son never challenged that boundary. Sensitive correspondence, staffing decisions, discretionary spending, and restricted access would now pass through officials directly accountable to the king. Camilla could still advise her husband privately. She could still express concern, argue, persuade, even disagree. What she could no longer do was turn that private access into independent operational power. The king looked exhausted rather than victorious as he reached the final page. His hand stopped before approving the last restriction. William noticed the hesitation and said nothing. He understood that every safeguard strengthened the crown while deepening the wound inside his father's marriage. Charles finally looked up and asked the question he had avoided all evening. Had he been cruel? William chose his words carefully. He told Charles that cruelty would have been allowing uncertainty to spread, until no one inside the household knew whose authority they were obeying. The future king did not celebrate the decision. He simply reminded his father that trust in the crown depended on clarity. The answer was logical, but it gave the monarch no comfort. Then, the access review produced another shock. Several members of Camilla's household still held permissions beyond their newly defined duties. Those permissions were cancelled immediately. More damaging still, any future request from her office touching Charles's official work would now require written authorization. No verbal shortcuts, no assumed approval, no room for interpretation. Camilla learned that final restriction the next morning, not from her husband, but when one of her most trusted aides sent what had once been a routine instruction and received a rejection. The decision sounded clinical on paper, But its true brutality became clear when the palace simply stopped moving when she spoke. Power is easiest to understand when it suddenly disappears. Camilla discovered that truth through small moments rather than one grand announcement. A request was returned. A meeting was rerouted. An aide who once answered immediately now asked for written clearance. Nothing looked dramatic from the outside, yet each interruption delivered the same message. The invisible authority she had spent years building around herself no longer existed, and everyone inside the palace already knew it. Camilla felt the change before anyone needed to explain it. The emergency directive had taken effect immediately, and staff who once acted through her authority were now required to clear any operational instruction affecting Charles through the centralized household structure, the formal system controlling how orders move through the monarch's staff. That distinction mattered because she had not lost her public place beside the king. Her ceremonial schedule remained untouched. She could still appear, attend, represent, and stand beside him. What had vanished was the machinery behind the role. The humiliation became real when her senior aide entered carrying a returned instruction. Camilla looked at the page before the aide spoke. "They require the king's approval now." She read the note once, then again, as if repetition might change what it meant. It did not. The queen consort placed it face down and asked the question she had been trying not to ask. Had everyone already been told? The aide hesitated, then confirmed it. Every relevant office had received the new protocol overnight. Camilla's composure slipped. She had imagined restrictions being discussed, perhaps negotiated, perhaps softened. Instead, the entire household had been reorganized while she was still absorbing the original decision. The deepest humiliation was not simply that power had been removed. It was realizing others understood the full scale of her loss before she did. Then more consequences followed. Several staffing decisions were frozen immediately. One planned internal appointment disappeared altogether because it had been initiated through authority she no longer possessed. What had once required a phone call now required written permission. What had once moved quietly now stopped. Camilla finally asked Charles to reconsider at least part of the order. The answer came through his private secretary, the senior official who manages the monarch's official business and communications. One sentence. No explanation, no compromise. The directive stands. The words wounded more than anger might have. Her husband was refusing even a symbolic retreat. Then, later, Charles came to her without staff, files, or advisors. By nightfall, Camilla knew exactly what she had lost. But the hardest conversation was still ahead, because this time, the king was coming not as sovereign, but as the man who had shared most of his life with her. The turning point did not come in a council chamber. It came after the staff had gone, when Charles entered Camilla's private sitting room alone. There were no files beneath his arm, and no aide waiting outside to rescue either of them from silence. For years, their bond had survived public condemnation, family resistance, and relentless scrutiny. Now it faced something more intimate. The possibility that love could remain, while trust in power did not. Camilla did not begin with anger. She told Charles that everything she had done came from the same instinct that had guided her for years. Protect him from people pulling him in different directions. Protect his time. Protect his strength. Protect the space around him. The king listened without interrupting. Her ceremonial role, the public duties and appearances she performed beside the monarch, was not being taken away, but the private freedom surrounding that role had changed permanently. Charles answered softly that protection could not depend on authority he had never knowingly granted. He reminded Camilla that the issue was no longer whether she meant well. It was whether staff had been allowed to act as though her decisions carried his approval. The distinction mattered, because a marriage could survive disagreement, but the crown could not function if its authority became uncertain. Camilla finally asked the question beneath every argument they had avoided. Did he still trust her as his wife? Charles paused. Then he said yes, but he added that he could no longer trust the informal systems built around her office. The queen consort absorbed the words in silence. They were devastating precisely because they were not cruel. He had separated personal love from institutional trust, and she understood there would be no simple way to merge them again. Charles then admitted something he had hidden from everyone. He had delayed acting because he feared that restricting Camilla after everything they had endured together would feel like betrayal. For years, he had defended her against criticism and rejection. But once the evidence surfaced, the king realized that refusing to act would become another kind of betrayal, one aimed at the crown he had sworn to protect. Camilla's resistance finally broke. She told him she would not challenge the directive publicly and would not ask again for its reversal. The emotional battle ended there, even though the consequences did not. By morning, their private understanding would be tested beyond the palace walls. Charles and Camilla had reached a painful peace, but dawn carried their crisis outside, where one public image would turn a hidden royal wound into a national spectacle. By morning, the palace could no longer control the meaning of what had happened. The decision that began behind closed doors was now being interpreted on television screens, newspaper pages, and outside royal gates. Yet one moment captured the mood better than any headline. Beneath the stone facade of Buckingham Palace, a growing crowd watched reporters repeat the same extraordinary sentence: that Camilla remained beside the king, but the independent authority around her had been stripped away. Charles watched part of the morning coverage with the sound turned down. Commentators described the decision as one of the strongest internal corrections of his reign, focusing on the sharp separation between Camilla's public status and the private power once exercised through her household. Those reporting lines, the formal routes through which staff receive instructions and approvals, had already changed across several offices. That mattered because the palace could refuse to discuss the evidence, but it could not hide the consequences. The king remained still until a screen placed his photograph beside Camilla's. Then he turned away before the segment finished. Charles had known the decision would hurt her privately. Watching that pain become public was different. The monarch had protected the crown, but now he could see what protection looked like when translated into humiliation. Camilla received a separate briefing describing the press reaction. She listened without interrupting, then asked for the television in her room to be switched off. The queen consort was no longer arguing. Anger had given way to exhaustion. Her name was everywhere, yet the person at the center of the storm wanted only silence. Then, one image took hold of the public mood. A special morning edition appeared beneath the banner, "Crown Draws the Line," with side-by-side photographs of Charles and Camilla. Outside Buckingham Palace, cameras caught a woman in the crowd holding the paper open, as reporters explained that the marriage remained intact, while the authority around the Queen had been cut back. That single image turned an internal struggle into something the entire country could understand. William refused to issue a personal statement. The prince knew that speaking now could transform the crisis into a battle between father and son, or make Camilla's fall appear like his victory. His silence left responsibility exactly where it belonged, with Charles. The crowd saw humiliation. The headlines saw power. The family saw something more painful, and now only one question remained: whether the king had destroyed Camilla's place, or finally drawn the boundary the crown needed to survive. In the end, there was no dramatic exile, no destroyed marriage, and no triumphant victor standing over the defeated. What happened was harsher because it was more precise. Charles kept Camilla beside him as his wife, while removing the independent authority that had become impossible to defend. She remained inside the royal story, but no longer above its boundaries. And for the monarchy, that distinction became the final verdict on the entire crisis. Charles never moved to reverse the emergency directive once the public pressure intensified. The order, the formal instruction controlling how royal staff, spending, correspondence, and internal authority would now operate, remained fully in force. Camilla kept her ceremonial duties and public place beside him, but sensitive staffing, financial discretion, restricted correspondence, and instructions affecting the king's official household now required formal approval. That permanence mattered, because it proved this was not a temporary response to headlines. The structure itself had changed. Camilla understood that truth during a quiet family dinner after the worst of the coverage had passed. She took her seat without mentioning the crisis. Charles sat beside her, and for one brief moment, the king placed his hand over hers. She did not pull away. Neither spoke about the directive. Their silence said enough. The marriage had survived, but the old balance of power between them had not. William noticed the gesture and deliberately looked elsewhere. The prince understood what his father had finally separated. Private love and institutional authority were not the same thing. Camilla could remain deeply important to Charles without being allowed to exercise power through assumption. The future king did not need her humiliation to become revenge. For him, the boundary itself was the victory. The evidence had changed more than one marriage. It exposed the danger of invisible authority moving through a royal household without clear permission. Charles answered that danger with a principle stronger than personal loyalty. No spouse, advisor, favorite, or relative could speak with sovereign power simply because they stood close to the monarch. Camilla's deepest loss was therefore not a title, a residence, or a public role. It was the unwritten freedom to act around the crown without constant formal approval. Once that trust disappeared, affection alone could not restore it. Charles chose the monarchy without discarding the woman he loved. Camilla endured humiliation without being erased. William watched his father establish a boundary future reigns would inherit. Personal loyalty survived. Unofficial power did not. There is nowhere else for this decision to go. Charles drew the line. Camilla accepted its permanence, and the monarchy closed the chapter with one unmistakable principle. Love may stand beside the crown, but it can never command in its name. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.